Broadcasting the information the mainstream media won't touch. This is The Richie Allen Show in association with DavidIke.com.
I think we're having slight connection problems to our good friend Ray McGovern there, a legendary CIA officer, of course, political activist, somebody you see regularly on television talking about these issues. But I'm not sure we're connected. So I'm going to say hello to Ray and hope we are connected. Are we connected, Ray? There you are.
Yeah, we are.
There was all sorts of problems there when I had the music on. I couldn't hear you, or you couldn't hear me, but there you are. You're there anyway.
Okay.
How are you?
Doing fine. And yourself?
Couldn't be better, Ray. Thanks. And thanks for coming on. There's a bit of an echo there. I'm hearing myself coming back to me. I don't know if we can sort that out. But thanks for joining us, my friend. I know you get a lot of these requests, especially now. Talking in the monologue, Ray, about watching cable news over the weekend and seeing a procession of men and women paraded out to talk about how Russian airstrikes are targeting moderate rebels, decent people whom are looking for justice and looking for democracy in Syria. To make matters worse, we're learning that, or we're told that, not only are they doing that, but they're hanging around, and when people are coming to aid the injured, they're firing on them as well. And while this is going on in America, as you're probably aware, Ray, in Europe, on all the talk shows, on the Sunday talk shows, we're learning that it's vital that Europe stays united, that Britain stays in Europe because of the big threat that Russia poses. And we do, of course, know that Defence Secretary Ashton Carter put Russia at the top of a list of external threats to the United States, and Islamic State, or Daesh, was down in 5th place. Ray, what's going on here?
Well, bottom line, Richie is the what Eisenhower called the military-industrial complex. There's a lot of money to be made out of tension, out of small wars. As long as you can keep them small, keep them going, drone the heck out of countries. That way you assure a constant supply of terrorists, so-called. And that's pretty much at the bottom of this. It's also having a lot to do with campaign rhetoric in the United States, and the fact that people like folks in London are really no more than vassals to the United States. And so if the U.S. says, look, stay in NATO, they will obey, they will salute smartly and do so. So the U.S. is exerting its, quote, leadership, end quote, role in Europe. And that's just a matter of time before the Europeans grow up, stop acting like adolescents and start acting like adults, because the sanctions, in particular the economic sanctions, are hurting the West Europeans and the East Europeans, for that matter, just as much as they're hurting the Russians. So who's responsible for the sanctions? The U.S. is. How did they persuade the Europeans to go along with them? MH17, pure and simple. MH17 fell down from the skies, shot down from the skies on July 17th, 2014.
14, that's right, yeah.
And 2 weeks later, the Europeans were blaming Russia for doing that and imposed sanctions, as the U.S. had been trying to get them to impose for a long time. So, long story short, if you want to make Putin out to be worse than Saddam Hussein or Bashar al-Assad or other devils incarnate, then you blame him on things like downing a passenger plane, killing 298 people, without adducing any proof at all, that either the Russians or the so-called pro-Russian separatists, end quote, were responsible.
The old adage, Ray, isn't it, about a lie travelling twice around the world before the truth has a chance to put its trousers on, when you think about it. But these are very serious times, Ray. How serious are these times, in your opinion, compared to, various flashpoints in the 1970s and 1980s, in terms of we have all sorts of claims? When we've heard claims, Ray, in the past that these sorts of alleged war crimes are taking place. And these are very serious claims being made against the Russian military. They've usually been followed by very, very serious conflict or a very, very serious upscaling or increasing of tension. Where is this going to go? Because we hear from people on this program from time to time, learned men and women like yourself, sometimes not so learned maybe, but they say ultimately what's going on here is there is an agenda to push Russia and China, or to pull them into a conflict, whether it's a Cold War or a hot war with European Union and the United States. What do you say to that?
Well, I think this could happen if the current trend continues along the lines that it has been going. Whether anybody in their sane mind would want this to happen is really hard to believe. Now, there is a lot of insanity being demonstrated, particularly among the Republican candidates for president. There's this breastfeeding and these bellowing and how bad the Russians and so forth are, blaming them for everything except global warming. I suppose they'll come to that as well. So, if I were Putin and I were looking on this situation, and I would have watched at least segments of the most recent Republican candidates debate, I would be telling my strategic arms, my strategic rocket forces, to get out there in the field and practice dispersing, practice everything short of a launch. And guess what? That's precisely what Putin has done. These encroachments, these violations of our promises after the Berlin Wall fell and after the Soviet Union imploded, not to station troops, not to add countries to the NATO organization, which is a military organization east of East Germany. Now, within a decade, we had violated that pledge to the point of doubling, that is 2 times the size of NATO, from 12 to 24. Now, why do we do that? Well, initially it was because we could. We just made a promise. We can violate that promise, and that's precisely the road we went down. Finally, there was one, what shall we say, regime change. One regime change too many. That was the one in Kiev, which is openly advertised 2.5 weeks before it by a inadvertent slip where the Assistant Secretary for European Affairs, Victoria Nuland, found herself on the phone with the U.S. ambassador in Kiev. And as you may remember, her conversation went like this: Jeff, we're all set now. You tell Klitschko and the others to wait in the wings. Yats is the guy. He knows about the World Bank. He knows about austerity. He knows what's going to have to happen. Yats is the guy. Okay. That was early February, just around now, 2 years ago. Now, what happened on the 22nd of February is what George Friedman of Stratfor calls the most blatant coup in human history. Why? Because it was advertised beforehand, and because the people behind it were very clear. It was your people. It was my people. It was the Western Alliance, spearheaded by not only the security services, but by proto-fascists, almost Nazis.
Nazis, yeah.
Housing there and flying their flag. So that's what happened on the 22nd. Now, what happened? What happened since then? Well, what you hear in Western media, the BBC calls me up and says, all right, Mr. McGovern, we'd like to hear what you're thinking about the annexation of Crimea. And I say, well, why do you want to start the story at the 5th inning? Oh, what do you mean, the 5th inning? I said, well, that came after a U.S. Western-sponsored coup in Kiev, and that's where the story starts. What Putin and the Russians were doing was reacting to the prospect of yet another NATO member on their doorstep, embracing Crimea as part of a NATO-based system, no longer Russia's only warm water port. That's where it starts. You want to start there? Let's start there. Well, no, we want to talk about the Crimea. It's so bad.
Did that interview take place, Ray? I'm guessing they said, we'll call you another day then. I imagine they didn't go through with it.
It was, one of these 5-6 minutes. I was in Moscow at the time, actually. I was just waking up from one of my little sleeps after a long plane ride. And so that would have been, maybe a year and a half ago. But I haven't had any invitations from the BBC since, so surprise, surprise. The point is that even Americans are so malnourished on genuine, accurate information about Ukraine, for example, that here's an example. I was speaking with a group of progressives. They belong to Pax Christi, the Catholic progressive anti-war organization. And there was a woman professor there, and she said, "I'm so proud of my 8-year-old son. He came home with a poster that he made, and it said, 'Putin, don't you know about thou shalt not kill?'" Now, always the skunk at the picnic. I raised my hand. I said, "Well, can you tell me what he's alluding to?" And she said, "Oh, Crimea, the siege of the invasion of Crimea." I said, "Well, how many people were killed?" "Oh, hundreds, probably thousands." "Would you believe 0? No.
None, Ray, yeah. None, yeah.
So that's how deprived these people. They're good, well-meaning people, but they have no access to accurate information. Another example, March of last year, a headline in the Washington Post: Putin had planned to seize Crimea way ahead of time. Okay? Way ahead of early plan, I guess is what they said. First paragraph: Putin now admits on a movie that was made, a video, that he convened his national security advisors on the evening of the 23rd of February and planned what they should do about Crimea. Blah, 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 blah. Never mentioned is what happened on the 22nd of February.
Never mention it, no.
That's when the coup happened. If I were Putin and I didn't convene my national security advisors to figure out what to do with our sole warm water Navy point, I would be derelict in my duty. And as you know, it was not invaded. It was not seized. There was a plebiscite. And as everyone knew, the predominantly pro-Russian sentiment in Crimea said, yeah, please tack us back on to Russia. We don't want any part of these neo-Nazis that have taken charge of Kiev.
Well, I was making television shows in London, and I did a debate which got heated, but it was respectful, with a Ukrainian breakfast news presenter from a radio show. And he was desperately keen to see the back of Yanukovych at the time, and they were delighted with Poroshenko, and they wanted to embrace the new world and the European Union. And I was trying to explain to him, as an Irishman, what membership of the European Union and enslavement, effectively, to the European Central Bank, the IMF, the Troika, as we came to call them, what that had meant for Ireland and all the other countries. And I referred him to articles that have been written over the years and books by people like John Perkins and others. And I said, this is what it's about, mate. They're going to get you, ultimately, they want to enslave you financially. They want to get you up to your necks in debt. You'll never be able to pay it. And then they start picking off the real wealth in your countries, like they've done to my country, Ireland. I can't believe what's happening in my country, Ray. And we got into all of this sort of stuff. And he didn't go along with it. And of course, shortly afterwards, the European Union America backed a massive loan from the European Union to Ukraine. There's a Chicago woman currently operating as the finance minister of Ukraine. Everything you said, to be fair, and by the way, you can read Ray at raymcgovern.com. Everything Ray's been saying in the last couple of years has basically come to pass. Now, here's my question for you. It's a long question, but I'm going to ask you this and I'm going to get out. We touched on this before. By the way, folks, it's 16 to the top of the hour. The great Ray McGovern is on with us. Delighted that he's on. Check out, as I said, raymcgovern.com. Terrific articles on there. Ray, we know that through the former French foreign minister, through leaks, through former CIA, MI6 and MI5 personnel, that the so-called Arab Spring in Syria was basically started, was enabled, was funded, and was set in motion by Western intelligence agencies because they wanted rid of Bashar al-Assad. I think we all accept that. Now we're learning, horrifically, after NATO destroyed Libya 4 or 5 years ago, we're now hearing that there's a genuine movement in Britain to maybe look at ground operations in Libya because of the so-called threat of the Islamic State. We're hearing today the United Arab Emirates, along with Bahrain and Saudi Arabia, confirming that, yes, they love to send their troops in on the ground into Syria, so long as the United States led the operation. You have obviously the reaction that we've been talking about, or lack of reaction to date from the Russians. You see, Ray, I look at this and I keep coming back to this point, and I think you've disagreed with me on this before. To me, none of this is bad planning, bad management, or folly, or greed, or about oil and resources. To me, this is pushing us down the road of a single world government, a centralisation of power. And I know it's an old argument, this, but I can't see it going any other way, Ray. This is what I see. All those thousands and maybe even millions of migrants being forced out of Syria into Western Europe. A lot of those migrants contain lunatic jihadists who undoubtedly are going to do bad things in some of these countries they get into. Of course, there are some genuine asylum seekers and refugees as well, because we've carpet bombed their houses. People know what's going to happen, Ray. They know the results of this. So why are they doing it? Am I right? Is it about a one world government and the centralisation of power?
Well, I think it's complicated. It has to do with the fact that war is very good for business and peace is very bad for business. So when you ask, for example, why the U.S. is droning the hell out of people in Pakistan and Afghanistan and Somalia and Libya and elsewhere, well, there's an eternal supply of jihadists to be gotten from that. The top generals in our country have talked in a most amazing way about looking forward to a 30 years war. Now, there's a point there, Richie. 30 years war, you people in Europe know about a 30 years war, right? We don't.
Yeah.
We have no real experience.
None whatsoever. No. Not in our lifetime, no.
And the folks that are running our country, all the less. None of those Republican candidates had any uniform ever on, except maybe a Boy Scout or a Girl Scout or something like that. So that's part of it. The other is one can't really underestimate the stupidity of politicians. Now, Obama doesn't know what he's doing in the Middle East, and he's a very poor choice. He's a very poor chooser of advisors. There isn't a person among his close advisors that I can finger that knows anything about Russia, Russian history, Soviet history, whatever, okay? All he knows is that he's got to sort of bend and look tough, and not too tough. He didn't want to get involved in another war, but he allows Ashton Carter, the Secretary of Defense, and others to go out and say really ridiculous things. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. What's the biggest problem? Russia. Russia is an existential threat to the United States. Well, give me a break. Russia is reacting to what the U.S. is doing in NATO and in Ukraine. And if they weren't reacting in the way they are, I would say Putin should be should be impeached.
Yeah.
What they're doing is building up because they see the U.S. surrounding them again with anti-ballistic missile systems that you and I can be confident don't really work. But how can Putin sell that to his generals? They don't work anyway. Don't forget about it. Well, no, he's not doing that. He's building up himself. So we have a situation here that we have not witnessed, and mark my words here, since before 1972. In 1972, May, I was in Moscow, and we concluded, I was part of the delegation, we concluded an anti-ballistic missile treaty, a temporary agreement on interim agreement, we call it, on offensive missiles. And that's when we stopped the arms race. Now, what did Bush do? First thing he did was rescind or get out of the anti-ballistic missile system. So there are a lot of people making a hell of a lot of dough on all this uncertainty and all these wars. And the people that should be objecting, the American people, well, they sort of sit back and say, well, we have no real skin in this game. This is a volunteer army.
Yeah.
That means a draft of the poor kids that can't get a job or can't get an education. Most of the kids in the army are from from villages and from towns in the United States of less than 50,000 people, or from the inner city. Now, you call that a volunteer army? That's a poverty draft. But as long as, quote, nobody important, end quote, has any skin in the game, it's allowed to continue, and it's across a big ocean, and the British will always support us, and we can have lots of leverage on the others as well. So let's just live it out and hope that our empire lasts as long as possible.
Ray, can it be argued? When you talk about the financial gain and the mega corporations who manufacture the horrible weapons that are sold we know they're sold in the billions of dollars and pounds every year. And I don't argue with that. That's absolutely a factor. But can it not be argued, because of history, looking back on history, looking back at the last 2 to 3, 4 years, that there's something bigger going on here, that the likes of Barack Obama and David Cameron and even Vladimir Putin maybe, that this is a puppet show. These guys are not really calling the shots. That the people really calling the shots are the people who run the central banks, the Rothschilds, the others who run these central banks. And, I keep going back to the one world government thing and ultimately the enslavement of humanity. And you might think it's crazy conspiracy theory. But Ray, when agreements like the TPP, Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, are signed, and they want to pass this Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, TTIP agreement, between Europe and the United States, which will ultimately, Ray, and I don't think I can be accused of exaggeration, will basically dissolve the idea or the notion of sovereignty entirely, and will hand their countries and the running of them over to, a tiny, 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 tiny amount of corporations. To me, I just add those, maybe I connect those dots, Ray, and I come to a different conclusion to you. I'm deeply respectful of you because of all you've achieved and where you've been, and I'm listening to you. But I think it goes far, far deeper than that. But you don't, obviously.
Well, no. I don't want to be misunderstood here, Richie.
I'm not putting words in your mouth. I'd love to know where you're coming from.
Yeah, you and I are not very far away here. Money corrupts, and power and everything else corrupts, absolutely. What we have is a deep state. What we have is a situation where those trade agreements can be conducted in secret for the benefit and with the participation of the large mega multinational corporations. So you're right. These people are calling the shots, and the typical trappings of democracy. We get a chance to elect representatives and senators in November, but they're all bought. They're already bought ahead of time by contributions from these conglomerates. So I don't think you're far off in suggesting that these people don't have an awful lot of leverage. I would accept Putin from that. I think that he enjoys, largely because of the way the West is acting toward him, he enjoys a great deal of popular support and a good deal more authority over what happens in Russia and abroad than his two counterparts that you mentioned, the satrap Cameron and the fellow normally in charge of Washington, the fellow named Obama. So, yeah, it's a deep problem. And, when you talk about, arms trades, this is one thing that the Pope said right, and was pretty courageous. He's in Congress, right? And he talks about the blood-drenched arms trader.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, what does that mean? You talked about billions. Would you believe the U.S. arms traders have offered Saudi Arabia $100 billion worth of arms during the Obama administration alone? Now, people say, 100 billion. Yeah, it is 100 billion with a B, right? But they say, only a portion of that have been approved. Yeah, only 50 billion so far. Now, that speaks. And when you ask somebody, why won't you speak up and name Saudi Arabia and Qatar and the others that are financing and supporting ISIS? They start twitching nervously.
Yeah.
Because you can't mention Saudi Arabia because maybe they'll sell to the British or maybe to the French. $50 billion is a lot of money, okay? So, it's simplistic to reduce it solely to that. But in my view, it's largely that. And I think we're saying the same thing, are we not?
What can people do, Ray? We've got you till the top of the hour. We've got about 5-6 minutes left, and I'm glad you're on. I do genuinely love having you on and listening to you. It's not the sort of thing you're supposed to say as a, as an objective broadcaster. You're not supposed to say things like that. But no, I do love listening to you, and I love reading your website. Where's it all going to end, Ray? You're quite right. You said earlier on, we don't get to choose between the men and women whom we'd like to represent us and whom we'd like to make our world a better place for everybody. We don't. Not to kiss your arse, Ray, but you can't run, my friend. You can't run. You don't have the money and you wouldn't be allowed to run. It's as simple as that. So we're stuck with these corporate stooges. So what's the way out of that, Ray? Because I don't believe it's democracy. I also don't believe in violence. I do not believe in violence. I believe in the old adage, an eye for an eye makes the world blind. Violence is wrong, not having it. Is it non-violent civil disobedience, Ray, en masse? How do we get rid of these lunatics?
Well, I'm just out of jail.
I know, that's right. Yeah, that's true as well. I could have mentioned that in the opening if we didn't have the technical problems. But go ahead.
Probably should have explained.
Yeah.
Dr. King, our prophet, bar none, he's our prophet. Martin Luther King Jr., he said there is such a thing as too late. It's true. We are getting very close to the situation where we have our power deprived from us, where we have money ruling the system completely, and what we have to do is put our bodies into it. And you're right in stressing nonviolence. That's what we were doing up at a German Air Force base in Syracuse, New York, 2 weeks ago. We blocked both the entrance and the exit in a very artful way with the life-sized figures of one of the Berrigan brothers. It was a wonderful, imaginative action, but I have to go back up there on the 9th of March to get whatever punishment is meted out to me. The idea is you have to draw the American people's attention and the British people's attention. Veterans for Peace does that. Ben Griffin, there in Britain.
In London, yeah. Good guy, Ben, yeah.
Yeah, Veterans for Peace. You need to seek out the people who are willing to put their bodies on the line, who know what war is like, and you need to say, well, okay, maybe this is what the Germans didn't do. And that's precisely right. This is what the Germans didn't do. They couldn't find their voice. Their churches, Catholic and Evangelical Lutheran, couldn't find their voice. Everybody said, well, maybe be okay. Man, it's tough about all those Jews and stuff, but, maybe. Well, we should learn from that lesson. We have to get out there, and we can't claim immediate success, Did we have success up there in Syracuse at the Air Force Base? Well, we call some attention to what's going on, but we don't do it for success. Results are important, but they're secondary. The goodness of the act speaks for itself. And the challenge is to get that act and the goodness of it and the reason for it out into the media. And that's the challenge that we face. Thank God there's the web, there's the internet, there's alternative ways of people learning about things, and the younger generation doesn't read newspapers anymore, thank goodness, but due to country, things like yours, and I think that's the hope.
Ray, it's always a pleasure having you on the programme. Thanks for doing it. People, go to raymcgovern.com to find out what Ray is up to, where he's going to be. We do have a lot of listeners listening to this programme on the East Coast of the United States. If Ray's going to be speaking or if he's going to be around anywhere near you, do yourself a favour and go and meet the man, say hello to him and listen to him. Ray, thanks very much for your time, my friend. Look after yourself.
I will. Thank you.
And bye for now. The great Ray McGovern on the line to us there from his home, not too far from DC. A number of comments came in during that. A number of people commenting on Ray's take on it, the incompetence and the greed of politicians. A number of you saying, well, look, it's more than that. I did put that point to Ray. Ray knows, I've known Ray since the People's Voice in London, and Ray is well aware of the opinions I hold about the true nature of this and the non-human nature of it and what's really behind it, what I think is really behind it. And Ray doesn't necessarily share that opinion, but and I'm not going to patronise him by in any way saying that he doesn't get it. because that would be rude and it would be kind of pathetic, because I think Ray McGovern has more brain cells in his backside than I do in my head. But we're fighting the same enemy, but how far it goes, I suppose, and where it goes, we have a difference of opinion on. But that's fine. It really is. Ray McGovern is one of the good guys.